February 13th, 2025. The United States Department of Justice is in turmoil. Within a span of just 48 hours, 7 senior federal prosecutors from different offices resign in rapid succession. Their reason? They refuse to carry out an order they believe violates their oath to uphold the law without fear or favor. The directive in question: drop corruption charges against a powerful politician who had aligned himself with the president's agenda. This is the story of what journalists quickly dubbed the Thursday Night Massacre, a crisis of justice that sent shockwaves through America's legal community. Today, we're counting down the 5 most severe crises of prosecutorial independence in American history, moments when the wall between politics and justice nearly collapsed. What makes the 2025 DOJ resignations so extraordinary? How does this episode compare to previous DOJ crises? And what does this extraordinary moment reveal about the fragility of the rule of law in America? These resignations didn't happen in a vacuum. They came shortly after a new presidential administration took office, with promises to overhaul what they called a weaponized Justice Department. But what happened next went beyond typical transitions of power. It challenged fundamental principles that had governed American justice for decades. So let's begin our countdown to understand what made the 2025 DOJ crisis so exceptional by comparing it to previous moments when the independence of American justice hung in the balance. In each case, we'll examine what core principle was at stake and how the crisis impacted the institution of justice in America. In late 2006 and early 2007, the Bush administration took the unusual step of dismissing 9 United States attorneys midway through their terms. While presidents appoint these federal prosecutors, once confirmed, they typically serve their full 4-year terms without political interference. These weren't routine replacements. They were targeted removals. Initially described as performance-related dismissals, internal documents later revealed a different story. The attorneys were evaluated not on their legal competence, but on their loyalty to the administration and willingness to pursue cases that might benefit Republican politics. Some had refused to rush voter fraud investigations before elections. Others had pursued corruption cases against Republican officials that angered party leadership. The controversy reached a breaking point when Attorney General Alberto Gonzales testified before Congress. His statements contradicted internal memos and emails, with Gonzales repeatedly claiming he wasn't involved in discussions about specific firings, despite evidence to the contrary. After months of escalating scandal, Gonzales ultimately resigned in August 2007. This episode revealed a troubling willingness to politicize prosecutorial decisions from the top down. However, it ranks 5th on our list because it differs from later crises in key ways. The attorneys were fired by leadership rather than resigning in protest of unethical orders. And while the dismissals appeared politically motivated, they weren't tied to interference in specific high-profile cases already underway. Still, the 2007 firings set an important precedent. They showed how even in modern America, there remained a temptation for presidents to view federal prosecutors as tools for advancing political interests, rather than independent enforcers of the law. The scandal also demonstrated that when such lines are crossed, institutional pushback and public accountability can still force correction, even if it takes time. In February 2020, career prosecutors in the Department of Justice recommended a sentence of 7 to 9 years for Roger Stone, a longtime associate of President Donald Trump. Stone had been convicted of 7 felonies, including witness tampering and lying to Congress during the Russia investigation. The prosecutor's recommendation was standard under DOJ guidelines for Stone's offenses. The next morning, President Trump tweeted that this was a horrible and very unfair situation and a miscarriage of justice. Within hours, in an extraordinary move, Attorney General William Barr overruled the career prosecutors, directing the filing of a new sentencing memo requesting a lighter sentence. The reaction from the prosecution team was immediate. All 4 line prosecutors withdrew from the case in protest. One of them, Jonathan Kravis, resigned from the Department of Justice entirely. In his resignation letter, Kravis made his reasoning clear. The department was abandoning its responsibility to apply the law equally to all Americans, regardless of their political connections. What makes this incident significant was the clear connection between the president's public demand and the department's abrupt reversal, breaking the firewall that traditionally separates White House political interests from prosecutorial decisions. It also demonstrated that career prosecutors had ethical lines they wouldn't cross, even when ordered by leadership. The Stone case lands at number 4 on our list because, while dramatic, it affected only the sentencing phase of a single case, not the dismissal of charges altogether. The 4 prosecutors who withdrew represented a significant protest, but the scale was smaller than later crises, and ultimately, Stone received a presidential pardon, which is a constitutionally authorized power, even if controversially applied. Nevertheless, the Stone sentencing controversy presaged deeper conflicts to come, as it normalized the idea that political allies could receive special treatment in the justice system, challenging the principle that the law applies equally to everyone. Just 10 days into the Trump administration, an extraordinary confrontation unfolded between the White House and the Department of Justice. Sally Yates, a career federal prosecutor with 27 years of service, who was temporarily leading the DOJ pending confirmation of a new attorney general, refused to defend President Trump's executive order banning travel from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. Yates sent a memo to DOJ attorneys instructing them not to present arguments in defense of the order. Her justification was clear. I am responsible for ensuring that the positions we take in court remain consistent with this institution's solemn obligation to always seek justice and stand for what is right. The White House response was swift and severe. Within hours, Yates was fired. A statement accused her of having betrayed the Department of Justice by refusing to enforce a legal order designed to protect citizens. This confrontation revealed a fundamental tension in the Department of Justice's dual identity. On one hand, the DOJ is part of the executive branch, headed by officials who serve at the president's pleasure. On the other hand, DOJ attorneys take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law, which sometimes means questioning directives they believe are unlawful. The Yates firing ranks 3rd on our countdown because it represented a clean break between DOJ leadership and the White House over a matter of constitutional principle. Unlike other entries on our list, Yates wasn't permitted the dignity of resignation. She was summarily dismissed for what she considered upholding her oath. However, this crisis differed from higher-ranking incidents in that it involved a policy disagreement rather than interference in a specific prosecution. While Yates believed the travel ban was unconstitutional, this was not a case of the White House attempting to shield allies from prosecution or target enemies with legal action. It was a dispute over the legality of a presidential policy directive, serious but different in nature from attempts to directly manipulate the justice system for political advantage. On October 20th, 1973, President Richard Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, who was investigating the Watergate break-in and Nixon's potential involvement in the cover-up. Cox had demanded access to Nixon's secret White House tape recordings, evidence that would ultimately prove devastating to the president. Richardson, who had promised Congress he would protect Cox's independence, refused the order and resigned immediately. Nixon then turned to Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus with the same demand. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned on the spot. The firing order then fell to Solicitor General Robert Bork, the third-ranking official at DOJ, who complied and dismissed Cox. The public reaction was explosive. Newspaper editorials compared Nixon to a dictator. Citizens sent hundreds of thousands of telegrams to Congress in protest. Within days, Nixon was forced to appoint a new special prosecutor and eventually surrender the tapes. Less than a year later, facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned the presidency. The Saturday Night Massacre represented a defining moment in American governance. A clear attempt by a president to obstruct justice by shutting down an investigation into his own conduct. Richardson and Ruckelshaus became heroes for their principled stands, choosing to sacrifice their careers rather than violate their ethical obligations. For nearly 50 years, this incident stood as the most severe crisis of prosecutorial independence in American history. It established a benchmark for courage in the face of presidential pressure and led to post-Watergate reforms that strengthened DOJ independence. The reason this ranks second rather than first on our list is that Nixon's interference, while grave, was focused narrowly on protecting himself from investigation. As severe as this was, it didn't represent an attempt to use the justice system as a broader political tool to reward allies and punish enemies. And while two officials resigned in protest, the scale was smaller than our top entry. In February 2025, Acting Deputy Attorney General Emil Bove sent a memo to prosecutors in the Southern District of New York with an extraordinary directive: dismiss the pending corruption charges against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. The stated rationale was that Adams's prosecution interfered with his ability to help implement the administration's immigration enforcement agenda, and that it could impact his re-election campaign. The case against Adams wasn't weak or politically motivated. It included substantial evidence of bribery, fraud, and soliciting foreign donations. In fact, it had been developed over years by career investigators following standard protocols. The order to dismiss had nothing to do with the evidence. It was explicitly about securing Adams's political cooperation. What happened next was unprecedented. Danielle Sassoon, the acting U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, refused to drop the case. In a letter to DOJ leadership, this Harvard and Yale-educated former clerk for Justice Scalia wrote that dismissing a valid indictment for reasons having nothing to do with the strength of the case would violate her oath to prosecute impartially. Sassoon resigned rather than comply. Assistant U.S. Attorney Hagan Scotton, a lead prosecutor on the Adams case, also resigned. A decorated Iraq War veteran and former clerk to Chief Justice Roberts, Scotton wrote a scathing resignation letter. No system of ordered liberty can allow the government to use the carrot of dismissing charges to induce an elected official to support its policy objectives. The resignations cascaded through the department. When DOJ leadership attempted to find someone else to drop the case. Kevin Driscoll, the acting head of the DOJ Criminal Division, quit rather than execute the order. When John Keller, the acting chief of the Public Integrity Section, was directed to dismiss the charges, he too resigned on the spot. 3 senior deputy attorneys in that section, Rob Heberly, Jen Clark, and Marco Palmieri, also quit when pressured to sign the dismissal motion. 7 prosecutors across multiple DOJ offices resigned rather than participate in what they viewed as a flagrant abuse of prosecutorial power. Most remarkably, many of these officials were conservatives and Trump appointees themselves, not partisan opponents. Sassoon was a member of the Federalist Society appointed by Trump just weeks earlier. Their objections were rooted in legal principle, not politics. What makes this crisis rank number 1 on our list? First, the unprecedented number of simultaneous resignations. 7 prosecutors across different offices, representing the largest mass resignation in DOJ history. Second, the explicit quid pro quo nature of the dismissal, dropping criminal charges in exchange for a politician's policy support, essentially trading away justice for political advantage. Third, the administration's response. Rather than addressing the ethical concerns, DOJ leadership placed other prosecutors on the case under investigation and threatened action against anyone who did not get in line. Fourth, this wasn't about self-protection, like Nixon's firing of Cox, but about using the justice system as a tool to reward a political ally, setting a dangerous precedent that could extend to both protecting friends and targeting enemies. The 2025 resignation crisis struck at the heart of prosecutorial independence in a way that even Watergate did not. It represented an attempt to fundamentally transform the Department of Justice from an independent law enforcement agency into an instrument of presidential power and political leverage. These 5 crises of prosecutorial independence aren't just fascinating historical episodes. They reveal an ongoing tension in American democracy with real consequences for how justice functions in our society. Since Watergate, the Department of Justice has operated under norms designed to maintain a firewall between political interests and prosecutorial decisions. These norms weren't just bureaucratic traditions. They protected a fundamental distinction between 2 very different systems: the rule of law versus rule by law. In a society governed by the rule of law, legal principles apply equally to everyone, regardless of wealth, status, or political connections. Presidents and paupers face the same standards of justice. Evidence and legal merit determine outcomes, not political calculation. In contrast, rule by law describes systems where laws become weapons in the hands of those in power, tools to reward friends, punish enemies, and entrench political advantage. In such systems, the question isn't, what does the law require, but who benefits from this application of law? When prosecutorial independence breaks down, the consequences aren't abstract. They're devastatingly concrete. Corruption goes unpunished if perpetrators have the right political connections. Political opponents face heightened scrutiny and aggressive charges. Citizens lose faith that the justice system treats everyone equally, corroding the social contract at its foundation. The historical pattern is clear. When the Justice Department's independence has been threatened, career officials have often been the last line of defense. Their willingness to resign, rather than comply with improper orders, has repeatedly forced course corrections and preserved institutional integrity. But relying on individual courage isn't a sustainable safeguard. The 2025 crisis raised urgent questions about what institutional protections could better insulate the Department of Justice from political pressure. Should special counsels have greater statutory independence? Should U.S. attorneys be removable only for cause? Should Maine justices' ability to overrule local prosecutors be limited in politically sensitive cases? These questions aren't merely academic. They go to the heart of whether America can maintain the promise etched on the Supreme Court building: equal justice under law. The alternative, a justice system that serves power rather than principle, would represent a fundamental transformation of American governance, regardless of which party holds power. As one of the resigning prosecutors in 2025 wrote, "I knew they would eventually find someone who is enough of a fool or enough of a coward to file your motion, but it was never going to be me." The question for American democracy is whether our institutions can be strengthened so that such courage isn't necessary, so that the rule of law doesn't depend on the willingness of individuals to sacrifice their careers to protect it. How did the 2025 DOJ resignations differ from the Saturday Night Massacre during Watergate? What made the 2025 crisis potentially more severe? If you were a DOJ prosecutor ordered to drop a solid case for political reasons, what factors would you consider in deciding whether to comply or resign? What structural reforms might better insulate the Department of Justice from political pressure while still maintaining appropriate democratic accountability? How might the erosion of prosecutorial independence affect public trust in the justice system over time? Can a democracy maintain the rule of law if its chief law enforcement officials view prosecution as a political tool rather than a professional duty?